Imagine this. Your wife sits you down after 7 years of marriage and casually drops the bomb. I slept with someone last night. You're supposed to explode, cry, beg, fight for her. That's the reaction she came for. But what if you just looked her in the eye, poured yourself a drink, and said, "Congrats. Keep watching, because in the next 5 minutes, you're about to discover the coldest, most calculated revenge a betrayed husband ever pulled off, without raising his voice once." The rain hammered against the windows of their downtown apartment. As Rebecca sat on the leather couch, her legs crossed, her expression carved from ice. David had just returned from what she believed was another late shift at the architecture firm. He loosened his tie, exhausted, but something in her posture made him pause. "We need to talk," she said, her voice flat. David nodded slowly, setting his briefcase down. 7 years of marriage had taught him to read her moods, and tonight felt different. Dangerous. Even. She leaned forward, her dark eyes searching his face for the reaction she craved. "I slept with someone last night." The words hung in the air like a guillotine blade. She waited for the explosion. The tears, the accusations, the desperate pleas for explanation. Instead, David reached for the whiskey on the side table, poured himself 2 fingers, and took a slow sip. "Congrats," he said quietly, his gaze never leaving hers. Rebecca's confident mask cracked. This wasn't the script she'd written in her head. She'd expected him to crumble, to give her the power she'd been seeking. Ever since their marriage had grown stale, she'd wanted him to beg, to ask who it was, to fight for her. But David just sat there, almost serene. "That's it?" she demanded, her voice rising. "That's all you have to say?" He swirled the amber liquid in his glass. "What do you want me to say, Rebecca? You made your choice." She stood up abruptly, her hands trembling, not with guilt, but with frustration. "You don't even care, do you? 7 years together. And you don't even care." David's jaw tightened, but he remained silent. Inside, his heart was a hurricane, but his face was a mask of stone. Because the truth was, he'd known for 5 days. The hotel receipt she'd carelessly left in her coat pocket. The text notifications that lit up her phone at 2 a.m. The perfume that wasn't hers clinging to her skin when she crawled into bed that night, believing he was asleep. He'd cared. God, how he'd cared. But caring wasn't enough anymore. 5 days earlier, David had been cleaning out the hall closet when Rebecca's winter coat fell from its hanger. As he picked it up, a folded receipt tumbled onto the hardwood floor. The Grand Meridian Hotel, room 847. 1 night. 2 guests. His hands had gone numb as he stared at the date. Last Tuesday. The same night she told him she was attending a conference dinner with colleagues. He'd remembered kissing her goodbye, telling her to have fun, while she'd smiled and promised she'd be home late. That night, after Rebecca had gone to bed, David had waited until her breathing deepened into sleep. Then he'd carefully retrieved her phone from the nightstand, his heart pounding. He knew her passcode. Their anniversary. Ironically enough, the messages were all there. Months of them. Flirty texts that escalated into explicit plans. Photos she'd sent to someone named Jay in her contacts. Intimate pictures David had never seen. Poses she'd never offered him. The conversations revealed everything. The thrill of sneaking around. The complaints about their boring marriage. The promises of leaving him when she figured out the right moment. But what destroyed him most was reading her describe their last intimate moment together. She told this stranger how she'd closed her eyes and imagined someone else. How David no longer excited her. How she was just going through the motions until she could escape. He'd sat in the darkness of their bedroom, his wife sleeping peacefully beside him, and felt something inside him die. Not his love. That would take longer to bury. But his willingness to fight. For someone who saw him as an obstacle, rather than a partner. By dawn, David had made his decision. He wouldn't confront her. He wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him broken. Instead, he'd contacted an attorney that morning. A cutthroat divorce specialist. His colleague had recommended. He'd gathered evidence. Screenshots. Receipts. Testimony from the hotel staff he discreetly interviewed. And he'd waited. Over the next 5 days, David became a ghost in his own life. He went through the motions. Breakfast together. Small talk about work. Even making love to Rebecca when she initiated it. Though it felt like betraying himself. But every moment, he was gathering pieces. Building his exit strategy. His attorney, Patricia Hendris, was efficient and merciless. With this evidence, you'll get a favorable settlement, she told him during their second meeting. Infidelity isn't always a factor in New York divorces. But documented betrayal, especially with financial implications, changes things. David had discovered that Rebecca had been using their joint credit card for her affair. Fancy dinners, hotel rooms, gifts for her lover. She'd been careful, but not careful enough. Each charge was another nail in the coffin of their marriage. Wednesday night, Rebecca had dressed up, claiming she was meeting her sister for drinks. David had kissed her goodbye and told her he loved her, the words tasting like ash. Then he'd hired a private investigator to follow her. The photos arrived the next morning. Rebecca and a man David didn't recognize. Younger, muscular, tattooed, entering a boutique hotel in Brooklyn. The investigator had even captured them, through the sheer curtains of their room, locked in an embrace. That made David's stomach turn. But instead of rage, David felt clarity. This wasn't a mistake, or a moment of weakness. This was a choice Rebecca had made repeatedly, methodically, while coming home to him, and pretending everything was fine. Friday afternoon, David had met with a realtor. Their apartment was in both names, but he'd been the primary earner. He started looking at new places. Smaller, simpler, somewhere he could rebuild himself. That evening, Rebecca had been particularly affectionate. Perhaps sensing some distance in him, she'd cooked his favorite meal, worn the dress he loved, initiated intimacy with a passion that had been absent for months. David had responded, his body betraying the cold calculation in his mind. Afterward, as she lay beside him, satisfied and sleepy, he'd stared at the ceiling and felt nothing. Saturday, he'd signed the divorce papers. Now, as Rebecca stood before him, demanding a reaction to her confession, David felt a strange sense of peace. The storm had already passed through him. What remained was just the cleanup. "Why are you being like this?" Rebecca's voice cracked, genuine confusion breaking through her anger. "You're supposed to be upset." "I am upset," David said calmly, setting down his glass. "I've been upset for 5 days, Rebecca. Since I found the hotel receipt. Since I read your messages to Jay. Since I saw the photos of you two in Brooklyn last Wednesday." The color drained from her face. You knew?" "Of course I knew." He stood slowly, walking past her toward their bedroom. "You were never as careful as you thought you were." "David, wait." She grabbed his arm, panic replacing her earlier bravado. "Let me explain. It's not what you think. It was a mistake. It meant nothing." He gently removed her hand. "It meant something to me." In the bedroom, he retrieved the large manila envelope from his nightstand drawer, the one he'd prepared for this exact moment. When he returned to the living room, Rebecca was pacing, her carefully constructed revelation collapsing around her. "What's that?" she whispered. David handed it to her without ceremony. "Open it." With trembling fingers. She did. The divorce papers were on top, already signed by him, waiting only for her signature. Beneath them were printed screenshots of her messages, the hotel receipts, the credit card statements highlighted in yellow, and the photos from the private investigator. But the last item made her gasp. A lease agreement for a new apartment. In his name only. Dated to begin next week. "You're leaving," she said, the reality finally hitting her. "I already left. I just hadn't moved my body out yet. But I was supposed to." She couldn't finish the sentence. "You were supposed to what? Hurt me? Control me? Watch me beg?" David's voice remained steady, though his eyes held all the pain. He refused to vocalize. "You wanted power, Rebecca. You wanted to see me broken. But I'm not giving you that satisfaction." Rebecca collapsed onto the couch, the envelope spilling its contents across her lap. "David, please. We can work through this. I'll end it with him. I promise. It was just... I was confused. The marriage got stale and you chose to betray me. Instead of talking to me," David finished. "You chose to complain about our boring life. To a stranger. While I was here. Available. Wanting to make things work." She looked up at him, tears streaming down her face now. Real tears, perhaps. Or perhaps just panic at losing control of the narrative. "I do love you. I made a terrible mistake. But I love you." David reached into his pocket and pulled out his wedding ring. He held it for a moment, remembering the day she'd slipped it on his finger. The promises they'd made. Then he set it on the coffee table between them. "I loved you too," he said quietly. Past tense. "Don't do this," Rebecca pleaded, reaching for his hand. "Give me a chance to fix this. Let me prove I can change." For a moment, David almost wavered. 7 years of memories flickered through his mind. Their first date at the Italian restaurant downtown. Their wedding day in the rain. Lazy Sunday mornings in bed. Inside jokes that only they understood. But then he remembered the screenshots. Her words describing how she fantasized about someone else while with him. The calculated deception. "You'll need to sign those papers," he said, pulling his hand away. "My attorney will be in touch about dividing assets. The apartment is paid through next month. So you have time to figure out your next move. Where will you go? That's not your concern anymore." He walked to the door, picking up the overnight bag he'd packed earlier and hidden in the hall closet. "I'll have movers come for the rest of my things next week. You can keep whatever you want. David." Rebecca's voice was desperate now, all pretense gone. "You can't just leave me like this." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "Yes, I can. You ended our marriage. The moment you chose someone else. I'm just making it official. What about us? What about everything we built together?" David looked back at her one last time. She looked smaller somehow. Diminished. Sitting among the evidence of her betrayal. "You destroyed what we built. I'm just walking away from the rubble." "I'm sorry," she whispered. But whether she was sorry for the affair, or sorry she'd been caught, David would never know. "So am I," he said, and meant it. As he closed the door behind him, David heard her sobbing. He stood in the hallway for a moment, listening, feeling the weight of 7 years pressing down on his shoulders. But beneath the grief was something else. Something that felt almost like freedom. He walked to the elevator, pressed the button, and waited. When the doors opened, he stepped inside and watched the apartment door grow smaller. As he descended, with each floor, the heaviness lifted slightly. By the time he reached the lobby, David took his first full breath in 5 days. Outside, the rain had stopped. The streets were washed clean, reflecting the city lights and pools of water. David pulled out his phone and opened a new message to his attorney. "She has the papers. Let's proceed." Then he deleted Rebecca's contact from his phone, blocked her number, and started walking toward his new life. Alone, but unbroken. She'd wanted to destroy him with her confession. Instead, she'd destroyed herself. And David? He'd already moved on. Before she'd even noticed he was leaving. Sometimes the most powerful response to betrayal isn't rage. It's indifference. And sometimes, walking away in silence says more than any argument ever could. The chapter she tried to ruin was already closed. His next one was about to begin.